Hey everybody, welcome to City Lights. Welcome to the Poetry Room. To those of you online, welcome to you too. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people. It is always an honor and a privilege to do so. So it is a great pleasure to have Sophie Lewis here with us in the Poetry Room at City Lights, and featuring an amazing new book, Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Policewomen, and Girlbosses Against Liberation. It is published, of course, by our friends at Haymarket Books. It studies 200 years of enemy feminisms, making the case instead for a liberatory feminist politics. These enemy feminisms that are looked at through Ms. Lewis's glass are composed of imperial, racist, trans-exclusionary, anti-abortion, and authoritarian models. Ms. Lewis exposes how not all feminisms are seeking justice, inclusion, and equity. Enemy feminisms becomes a call to action for those of us seeking out and strengthening more humane and inclusionary forms of feminism. Sophie Lewis is the author of the books Abolish the Family, A Manifesto for Care and Liberation, and Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. She teaches online courses on utopian theory at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. She also has a visiting affiliation with the Center for Research on Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her writing has appeared in such journals as Feminist Theory, TSQ, Signs, N+1, Harper's, the New York Times, and on and on and on and on. Joining Sophie tonight is Eric A. Stanley, who's the author of Atmospheres of Violence, Structuring Antagonism, and the Trans Queer Ungovernable, and the co-editor of Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment, and the Prison Industrial Complex. They make our home here in San Francisco. We're going to be having a little Q&A. So for those of you online, we're sorry. We had a technical difficulty tonight. And so unfortunately, we can't do kind of audience Q&A for online, but we will do it in the audience. And I please ask you to wait until I come to you at the microphone. Otherwise, our friends online are not going to be able to hear you. So please join them a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, come on up. Yeah, this is yours. Thanks so much.
Thanks for that. Thanks for being here. It's almost 3 months since this book came out, so, terrifyingly, some of you may have actually read it and have precise questions. Actually, I'm not terrified. I think that'll be great if we can have a real conversation in the nitty-gritty. I usually read from the end of the intro, but I'm only going to do a tiny bit of that and then skip to a part that has a tiny bit more local relevance. So 2 little tastes is what I'm going to read, and then Eric and I will have a conversation. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Okay. Feminists committed racist mistakes and their feminisms reflected errors of judgment. This much, at last, we've been dragged, kicking and screaming, to recognize. But the culture still shows reluctance to contemplate the extent of some feminism's deeper theoretic entwinements with fascism. What we need now is a bestiary of enemy feminisms to jolt us into understanding that a woman's cry for women's power is sometimes part and parcel of the matrix of oppression. Is sometimes part and parcel of the oppressor's program. Even as we suffer loss in the short term, we can ultimately only gain as feminists when we accept that certain beloved old lines and lineages of feminism weren't just incidentally misogynist, but substantively so. That their core definitions were bourgeois, irremediably. That their racism was non-excisable. What are our other options? Shall we attempt the bonkers task of calling in people with opposite aims to our own, decolonizing what is squarely a form of colonialism? Or shall we break up the house of feminism, that battered and beloved fortress where so many of us have not lived well, and dare to name some feminisms enemies? Contra the aggrieved cries from certain quarters that it can only ever be patriarchy that benefits when feminists criticize other feminists, I affirm with Gloria Anzaldúa that lines of affinity, not identity, must be drawn. Some feminisms are obstacles to gender freedom, and asking which side are you on is the most elemental level of political physics. The side of women doesn't exist. It never existed. Okay, jumping almost to the end of the book. So this is more storytelling, I suppose. It's the end of a chapter, however. In 2012, the world mourned the death of Adrienne Rich, a gifted lesbian poet who made the regrettable decision to help Jan Raymond as she wrote The Transsexual Empire in 1979. Adrienne did not originate much enemy feminism, but despite leaving the cis-sexist anti-porn world, she never publicly sought to repair the harm her work with Raymond did. 3 days after her death, Bryn Kelly, the Appalachian writer and beloved New York community activist, posted her thoughts about Rich on her Tumblr. Lesbians in the 70s had it hard, and they still have it hard, Bryn wrote. They were marginally employed then, trying to make art and change that no one understood and that gets laughed at now. Their old cars break down all the time, and there is never any money to get them fixed, and they can't just bike around like they used to. All their spaces are gone, their bookstores, their cafes, their activist centers. They do not recognize what we call feminism as anything like the feminism they know and that has meant so much to them. And perhaps not surprisingly, they find our theory and our praxis highly suspect. They all have breast cancer. Some of them have had it a couple times. Bryn's comradely and forgiving words remind me of the recollections of Carla J., one of the members of Radical Lesbians, the 1970s group, about becoming close with Marsha P. Johnson, the decolonial gay liberation street queen who co-founded STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Quote, although she knew I had mixed feelings about transvestism, writes Jay, we became fast friends. This friendship clearly speaks of Johnson's great magnanimity, which even extended in Jay's own account to allowing Jay to gropingly inspect Marsha's breasts, but also attests to solidarities that formed between working class cis and trans women who both experienced misogyny within the gay movement. Carla interviewed Marsha as a gay sister for the 1972 Out of the Closets anthology and recalls how she and Marsha both always volunteered to be on cleanup duty after gay liberation movement dances, after which they typically went out together at 3 a.m. to eat at an all-night diner before continuing on to various after-hours bars. Once, inside an unmarked speakeasy only Marsha knew, Carla recalls asking, which is the women's room? In response, Marsha said, honey, just go into whichever one smells best. That's where the good dope's gonna be. Words to live by, in my opinion. Nonetheless, it was demoralizing and isolating as an experience to be a trans lesbian shortly after Adrienne Rich's death. Bryn Kelly recalls contemplating with paranoia her peers' apologism for Rich's still unaccounted for episode of feminist transmisogyny. Did she know, grieves Bryn? Did she really know how damaging her collusion on this work would be to generations of low-income trans people to come? How much deep suffering and heartache it would cause? How it would bestow on us a whole new set of knives to rip each other up with? We may never know the answer, and as the 21st century descends to new depths of anti-trans horror, knowing how to draw lines that say, this feminist is our enemy, is increasingly indispensable. Yet, as Bryn reminds us, figuring out how to live together is hard. To exist in community with people who constantly piss you off is exhausting, but ultimately worth it. Most non-trans feminists are not enemies. in all kinds of intergenerational feminist and lesbian communities, it often happens that someone says, quote, "Hey, did you know you hurt me? Can we talk about that?" And is heard. Okay, leave it there.
Thank you so much, and it's always such a pleasure to be able to hear an author read their work, right? It gives us such a different light. You know, I've been a big fan of your work for a very long time, and you're one of the people that I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna have to like freak out about this, which is nice in a negative way, because I can be like that. And so I really appreciated the offering of this book, so thank you for that, and everybody read it, buy it here or somewhere. You know, we've talked a little bit about the book so far, but you know, some things that I was really interested in, and also just, you know, bringing Bren's words into it. Like, it was surprising and beautiful, and like I almost cried when I was reading that part. And I was thinking a lot about the question of repair and what does it mean to attempt again and again to hold the space open a little bit, right? And so in both of those instances, Marcia and Bren are kind of holding open the space and like that pattern, right? And like, what does betrayal mean? You know, I don't know. It's something we can maybe talk about. But you know, one of the things that I was most struck by in reading this book was, you know, it's a contemporary account, but the contemporary always lives within the historical archive that you're thinking through. And that's, you know, among its many gifts is that. You know, I was joking that oftentimes I think, you know, history starts like 15 years ago or something like that. And you give us so much well-researched writing to think about the long arc of this problem, right? It's nothing new, of course. And then I was also thinking, like, what would it mean to teach this in an intro to gender women's studies class as a kind of anecdote to many of the other texts, or like a reading accompaniment? And I think that would be really great. And, you know, I obviously wrote in my book a lot, because that's what I do. And one of the things I wanted to ask you some about, and this ties back to that question, but I think it also is thinking about the historicity of the project itself, and you say in the introduction, bottom line, the biggest reason for British feminism's transphobia is empire. And I was wondering if you could start us there. Just that small question.
I do think that the answer to why TERF Island became TERF Island is more, it has more prongs to it. There's, you know, a little element of the legacy of 90s skepticism, and there's, you have to go deep into the sort of free thinking, free thought movement, which is centuries and centuries old. And also there are some other things about the British national character, which, as my friend Asa Sarrazin says, has a commitment to misery, you know, to being a bloody, difficult woman.
Maybe I belong there.
Yeah. And, you know, opposing others' self-actualization, you know, which is, you know, American at best, and, you know, sort of somehow unpatriotic at worst or something, right? So, you know, having a gender identity is like a frivolous self-indulgence in the discourse that has emerged in the UK. But yes, empire. So the reason this is helpful is because and it is a historicizing book. I think it is a theoretical intervention with a historicizing or method, and it starts with Wollstonecraft, because that's the, you know, the first words of Anglophone Western feminism as lots of us are taught it, right? And to begin there is also a way of showing a dialectic internal to feminism, because, and this is a shorthand, but, you know, Wollstonecraft is one opening definition of what feminism is. And it has to do with the empowerment of mother within the private nuclear household. So not everything about the world has to change. In fact, only really one thing very privately has to change in Wollstonecraft's picture, which is not, I'm not coming for Wollstonecraft. She's not in an enemy bin, don't worry. But there's another definition of feminism which follows quite soon after, which is abolition of the family, of extremely different definition, right? The word gets invented a few years later, in France, in the context of utopian socialism, feminism, and that's where it's coined. And far from representing the sort of pro-imperial project that Wollstonecraft proposes women's rights to be, because she's saying, and like literally a whole industry of debate exists about whether this was sincere or canny or what, right? To what extent did Wollstonecraft care about the British Empire more than anything else? The way she sort of sounds like, to what extent is it strategic that she is saying, gentlemen, don't worry, feminism won't undermine the hegemony of the British crown of the planet. Au contraire, it's going to really help, Okay, I have to start with the parentheses or we'll be here all night. But the second definition is very, very different. It's about the insurgency of children and women against the privatization of care into the nuclear household. And I'm not suggesting it's like a perfect thing, like Charles Fourier, the guy who came up with this, is also colonialist. However, since we're looking at this thing, feminism, which co-emerges with empire and capital accumulation, to think about empire as how we get to TERF Island in the 21st century is necessary, because even in that context, we have two wolves inside the story of feminism. And it's not a question of variations on a theme, which is I think that's the core sort of shape of the gesture I'm trying to make. And it's not, feminisms aren't just, different from one another and in disagreement with one another. There is actually an antagonism internal to feminism that means that there is enmity, that feminism is capacious enough to contain within itself its own enemies. And that's complicated. It's a story of a kinship between fascism and liberalism and revolutionary leftism that comes from a sort of shared legacy, a mutant DNA that we have to, contend with and not explain away by casting people outside of the family, the house of feminism. We have to do enmity inside the house. But sorry, very roundabout way. So empire is, a story amongst many other things of imposing cis sexuality on indigenous populations around the world. So some of the original feminist projects in the UK context were literally about the exciting adventure of the, quote unquote, new model English woman, the first feminist brand in a way. You know how there's Uncle Sam in the US? In the UK, there's John Bull. And the first feminists, in order to send women out into the colonies to clean up messy gender over there, and also just experience a nice time and stretch her legs. Literally bodily autonomy for the young English woman was sort of enacted and experienced at the expense of subjugated non-white populations who were paradoxically within this story almost required to remain quite gender traditional. However, she, Miss Jane Bull was the avatar, John Bull's daughter, and she was going to sally forth and eugenically inspire people with the radiance of her Anglo-Saxon femininity. So I tell the story from there because, although of course a lot of so-called gender critical personalities in the UK don't think they have anything to do with colonialism. Nonetheless, the more we descend into fascism over the last couple of years, the more you see a little bit of explicitness poking through actually. Like you do in fact see some of the big trans-exclusionary feminist luminaries, if that's the right word to use, of British culture, hearkening back to a time of, of British hegemony. And anti-Americanism plays a very kind of tricksy role there epistemically, as it's a kind of like substitute for racism. You can say things about Americans in the UK that you're really wanting to say about, about colonized people or black people or whatever. But that's a very specific kind of twist, which I think explains why it was able to take over this, and it's a tiny island, right? So the media oligopoly is, tiny. They all know each other. They all went to the same school, and so the notion that this very fringe, actually, ideology of second wave women's liberationism that actually got cooked up in the defeat moment, right, of women's liberation on the fringes of the US feminist movement ecology. And I cannot stress enough it as a reflection of counter-revolutionary kind of despair is where TERFism actually comes from. Then crosses over the pond to the UK, becomes super, developed in the context of the 80s anti-nuclear sort of women's lesbian separatist milieu in the UK, and then suddenly makes a leap into establishment, elite, common sense. So, and of course, some of us have been Cassandras, unhappily, premature anti-fascists, since 2011 or so. 2007, in fact, some people were beginning to, and J.K. Rowling was someone that, no one could have associated in the editors of the New York Times. Well, I'm not saying they now would be more receptive to the idea that she is, a fascist or something, However, it is more obvious now that she is willing to celebrate, and she and what she represents openly now at this point, after several years of moving in this direction, celebrate the Trump executive order, quote unquote, defending women against gender ideology extremism, aligning herself quite openly and full-throatedly with the MAGA agenda. And this is explained in terms of the left having forsaken women, right? That's always the red-brown gambit to say, well, I haven't moved. I remain as left as I ever was. However, the left has lost its mind and left feminism on the floor for Trump to pick up, and that's why I align myself with those Nazis, not because I'm a Nazi. This is the perennial move. So you asked me a too broad question, so I unfortunately haven't let you get a word in edgewise. But no, but yeah, there's a lot of empire in the early sections, in the early chapters. One of the early celebrity feminists in the US is this figure called Mae French Sheldon, who I think that's some people's favorite chapter because it's a very interesting story. You couldn't make up her biography, really. Like if you were a young, feministish college student in the 1890s in the US, you would probably have like a poster of Mae French Sheldon on your wall. She was giving lectures at all the women's colleges, and she had gone to Africa, quote unquote, alone and unescorted, with 150 porters that she had hired in Zanzibar on an ethnographic safari to Tanzania. And she was, showing many things at once, and there's a lot to unpack. She was proving that women could do science. She was admitted to the Royal Geographic Society because she was going to find things out about African people that only a woman could find out. And also she was going to prove that colonizing could be done more efficiently. And this has a relation to capitalism, actually. The sort of turn towards capitalist agendas and priorities within colonialism. If you did it less violently, a woman wouldn't have to kill so many people in the course of sort of traversing Africa. So she was the Lady Stanley, and the media just lapped it up and was like, oh, women has really conquered Africa and shown that if you have that kind of, I used the word eugenic before. This is the notion that something about a racial presence in the body actually transmits itself wordlessly and inspires obedience and devotion in the quote-unquote savage. And so she, the press in New York was like, this is incredible. And she came back home and basically told people, why is this feminism? It really is. She was a suffrage activist before she left. And when she came back, she was constantly saying, men in Africa might have been, barbarians, but they were much better to women than some of you lot. That was the sort of radical move. She was making the shocking move to sort of put feminism in the room by using the sort of example of the native, who apparently everyone had proposed marriage to her, was her fantasy, but in the bush. And then the final part of the story you can't make up is that she takes money from King Leopold II of Belgium to go and be a genocide apologist in the Congo. And those Africans are completely different, as she is equipped to tell you as a lady scientist who knows unreformable men when she sees them, right? So she has one trip to Africa where she says, no, these are great Africans who are very receptive to feminism. And then she goes again, literally as a genocide apologist, in order to grease the wheels of one of the, most horrific bloodbaths of the 20th century, right, in the Congo. And so that's a nice little story that I think of her as Daenerys Targaryen, kind of alone and unescorted, liberating the peoples of the enslaved city-states, and then ultimately sort of committing a genocide, right, which was the unfortunate end of that. Sorry if I'm spoiling something for you, but it was pretty awkward for Elizabeth Warren and all of those people who were celebrating Daenerys as someone who represents democracy and feminism and so on. Because anyway, the one good thing about Game of Thrones, I thought, was that it showed Daenerys becoming a Hitler, because that is actually how it went down. If you think she's May French Sheldon, which the wig is exactly the same. If you look at the okay, that might make me sound a little frivolous, but I promise there's more than just comparisons to Game of Thrones. But I am someone for whom history is a lot longer than 15 years. In fact, I sometimes get confused about a quote like, seeking ecstasy on the battlefield is a good example, right? This comes from the first wave, from the late 19th century, but it was picked up by sex radicals in the second wave. And I forget sometimes where it comes from, because for me, I do end up seeing echoes in the shape of feminist revolution, counter-revolution over several centuries. And that's part of what's been useful about dunking my head in the unsavory sort of tub of fascist feminism, really, over the course of researching this. And I'm looking forward to disagreeing with comrades again, not enemies. But it has been clarifying to me to also, since I have the stomach for it, I might as well, right? My partner can't.
Yeah, that's perhaps the other avatar for our colonial queen would be Dianne Feinstein, to bring it a little bit more local. And oftentimes we say that San Francisco is the laboratory of neoliberalism, and so your book is so useful for everyone that lives in the Bay Area to better understand how we got here. And I was particularly struck by what you were just saying around this idea that the right has really captured as if they are kind of a common sense. They're living in a kind of static state, right? And everyone else has moved too far. It's like we've moved too far towards whatever thing they don't like. And it's so incredibly powerful, right? It works so well. And that statement could describe the current state of politics in San Francisco in particular, with the far right capture of the city. I mean, the city has always been far right, but even farther. And so, one of the questions that I think your book really forces us all to keep asking ourselves, and we were talking a little bit about this last night, and I didn't want to get into it because I wanted to get into it here, but and I'm right there with you. Like, I'm generally a thinker that attempts to kind of stay in the stickiness, as you were saying last night, or with the trouble, or whatever it is. But that your argument that I think is incredibly compelling and historically true, that feminism holds both a kind of revolutionary promise and fascism, right? Or all these other assumed antagonisms, then what does it mean that we hold on to it, and why do we hold on to it? Like, what is its use value, or what is its use if it can do both of those things?
Yeah. In case some people are listening to that question and still, as almost I still feel it sometimes, and going, what the hell can they possibly mean like fascist feminism or feminist fascism, what, right? Maybe just a few words on that, right? Because it is an a priori oxymoron, right, in most of our knowledge production, and certainly in most, feminist academic approaches to things like, the estuary that formed in the UK between the suffragette militants and the British Union of Fascists, which is a particularly sort of unsavory topic that sometimes you'll find historians who are, committed liberal feminists, writing an entire book ostensibly to look at and consider, and somehow managing to not look at it at all because they've decided, and they say up front, there is no such thing as feminist fascism or fascist feminism. So let's just say that up front, and then you get the impression that the book is sort of completely, I don't know, it's schizophrenic. It's like it's avoiding itself. Because that conclusion has been reached before the inquiry begins, but the inquiry keeps kind of blowing up. Like the idea that, for instance, the radical feminist paramilitaries, right, the Women's Social Political Union in the UK was a paramilitary underground. It's not usually thought of that way, right? But many organizations existed that had different tactics. But, Emmeline Pankhurst's Cult of Personality was a paramilitary. We can get into that. They bombed the shit out of the UK between 1908 and 1913, whereas I think most of us are taught that they broke a few windows and went on hunger strike and were tortured in prison, which is also true, but they set off nitroglycerin bombs and incendiary devices all over the country, which is something that then got wiped from the history. In fact, literally very explicitly, when the history of the suffragette movement was written, they made the decision to, quote unquote, leave out the bombs. Like, shall we leave out the bombs? Let's leave out the bombs. And the Great War had just started, so everything was rather put in perspective and distracted. So after the war, it was a sort of a story of, of hunger striking exclusively. But the point is, many of the veterans of the terror campaign signed up for another adventure when it came along, a decade or so later, which was Sir Oswald Mosley's vision of a corporate state modeled on Mussolini's fascisti. And for the typical feminist historian, there are some options here. You can say that the fascists, this is what Julie Gottlieb says, stole the fire of the feminist militants. They stole it. They stole it. And so that I guess the women checked their feminism at the door, but they certainly weren't feminists anymore when they became black shirts, even though to a woman they say that their feminism deepened and radicalized within the BUF, and it was the BUF. This is what anyway, I'm going on too long, but fascism alone will realize the purpose of the militant women of the Pankhurst army, was the kind of quote that they were giving. So for them, it deepened the notion of gender radicalism, becoming a black shirt, a card-carrying fascist. So we need to, this is an egregious example, you might think, and it is. I'm also looking at other types of enemy feminism, including girl bosses, including femo-nationalists, and for some readers of the book, the fact that I'm proposing enmity vis-a-vis all of these archetypes is provocative. It's like a girl boss is not the same as a black shirt. I agree, but I think there is I think something very important about understanding that feminism is capable of being one of fascism's forms of appearance. I really do, especially, in fact, although all writers want to say now more than ever, especially right now. I wish my book wasn't so relevant, but I thought that the cop would win, not the felon, actually, in the last election. And, but here we are, and J.K. Rowling sort of aligning herself with Trump in the name of radical feminism, and Andrea Dworkin quoting is the situation we're in. Now, Dworkin is an example of what I think is a feminist structure of thought that is fascistic, actually. I know it sounds a bit hysterical to say so, but The claim to innocence that exists in this body of work is extremely connected to the settler colonial logic that culminates in annihilation of the native, for example, as we're seeing in Gaza and in Palestine at the moment, when you have a category woman, right, in Dworkin's case, that is not responsible for history. That's what she says explicitly, time and time again. You know, women will enter history at one future point. She, you know, for her, the most she can ever say is a pro-Nazi woman. You know, even though she has this wonderful work on right-wing women, you know, they're actually not agents of history. They're not responsible for empire, for example. I think this is extremely dangerous. No one ever mentions her final book, not counting the final autobiography, but her final book is a statement on the necessity for women to do woman Israel, like Israel for women. And what, you know, she's obviously not mapping this out because it's bananas, but that this is what she finally decides after 12 books women need to do. This is the one where she, you know, concludes what the implication is, given everything that she says we know. And it is, you know, a conclusion that comes off the back of the most, you know, thorough, and it's her longest, it's her most referenced tome, and she looks at the Shoah, she looks at the Nakba, she completely acknowledges a kind of an analogy between them, although she can't bring herself to speak it. She says it's intolerable to name it, but she's actually showing it, and she literally is willing to say this is the kind of situation that women are in. Israel's violence is terrible, comparable to the violence of the Shoah, and yet it is necessary. In the same way, she says that a woman killing her rapist is necessary and justified. Isn't that an astonishingly like evil argument? You know, you know, this is why I think we need to be willing to see what kinds of politics come from fighting for women, right? What definition of woman, you know? Gender is a contradictory and clusterfuck kind of concept, right? Building on top of it, in fact, kind of makes sense that you're going to have things that are not just different or uncomfortable vis-a-vis one another, but opposites, you know? Because and I mentioned a dialectic in feminist history. I think, you know, I mentioned seeking ecstasy on the battlefield. This is the sort of sex wars notion where the sex radicals were saying against people like Dworkin, we want to hold on to danger and pleasure, both. And if you uncouple feminism from one of these poles, you get to a very scary place. I mean, and by scary, I mean, you know, the kind of politics that in socialism, it used to be called the socialism of fools. Anti-Semitism, conspiracism, if you truncate your analysis, you cut off something vital that is important to understand, you can have an impulse towards liberatory politics or systemic analysis and plunge and become a brown shirt very easily, right? That's why the socialism of fools is a phrase that describes something a bit tragic about an impulse towards anti-capitalism that turns into fascism like that on a dime. In feminism, I think if you decide that woman is defined by suffering, you know, and you have no other pole, there's no dialectical sort of, you know, opposite, moving dynamic opposite to pull that around, you know, that becomes something that you set out to create and securitize. And people who are out there kind of retaining a foolish agnosticism about what women are or what they might become, you know, become traitors. Quite literally, you know, the hatred that there is in a line of feminism. And I know the phrase misogynist feminism sounds almost equally nuts on first encounter as the phrase feminist fascism or whatever, but this is what I think we need to call it, to understand how the vast body of unliberated women or whatever, right, who are out here enjoying sex with men or enjoying being women, when don't they know that woman is suffering, right? It becomes an ultimate betrayal, and the hatred really gets turned in that direction, not at the systems, the patriarchal systems, for example, that all of us are actually implicated in, right? And women included. For Dworkin, women don't, do bad stuff, I think, broadly speaking. Not really. And that is how settler colonialism also operates, right? It's like actually, the ethno-state that is being genocided. Right? Everything is like upside down land,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Fanon really helps us think about this, right? The ways in which the colonizer always feels as if they are the ones under attack, right? When they're the arbiters of genocide, right? You've given us lots to think about here. As you can see, you need to read the books. You get all these stories. One of the things, you have a line in here around, I couldn't actually find it. Like you define feminism as a prison on fire or something like that, which I really appreciated. And, I'm actually interested in your kind of, perhaps it's an unfair question, but so it is. Imagining the kinds of feminist interventions that are necessary now, given the kind of thick description that you offer us here. Like, it's not like, where do we go next? It's not really that. But I'm interested in like what kind of maneuvers are necessary to perhaps forge, with all the messiness, something a little bit less fucked up, which is as close to hope as I can ever get.
Damn. I said to Eric, please talk a lot. And then I proceed to give 20-minute answers to single questions. So, and also you asked me what is left of feminism, and I don't think I really got there. So this is another way of revisiting it, right? Like, yeah. I non-glibly, non-facetiously hope you understand that it is a love letter to feminism that I've written here. It's entirely where I live and intend to live. I shall not be evicted from here. It's kind of that's why that metaphor of the house is that, how much feminism historically, shall we say, that was called feminism by other people and by the people doing it, and that I would, unfortunately agree is feminism, is enemy feminism. Like, what percentage of the total? Is it quite a big percentage? The problem is, because actually, some of this is a problem of naming, and that's not trivial, right? But canonical feminist history has this giant unnamed undercommons as well, right? All of, Lola Olufemi and I were talking about this at the event we did in London. All of the sort of acts of marronage, of fugitivity, of, anti-colonial refusal, by enslaved or indigenous women that we might want to name as part of feminist history, in a very meaningful sense, is not part of feminist history, right? And is not it's important not to simply, it's important to be careful and thoughtful about how we're doing that act of arrogation. Like, this is feminism, right? This is the feminism. This is my feminism, not like the one I wish to inherit, the one whose ancestors are mine. That's where I choose my ancestors or whatever. Nonetheless, that's always also a little bit what one is doing, right? By seeking to look at gender liberatory thought of the past and say, I, living in feminism house, am carrying forward this tradition, right? Someone like Emma Goldman would probably be annoyed if you remembered and theorized her and labeled her as a feminist, right? Because for her, that word was just nonsense bullshit, bourgeois, And same for Kollontai, and same for lots of Black anti-colonial revolutionaries, you know? And so that in itself, that's another layer of a sort of certain fight, you know? It's like, I am actually sort of insisting, you know, you're feminists, guys, transgenerationally, like calling back through the ages. I don't want to give this territory up, because feminism is a great name. I don't really know a better one for the adequately radical critique of capital that tells us that a dignified life does not inhere in the production of surplus value, but in the communization of care, and the realization of the principle that life making is everyone's privilege, you know? So it's very much different from the feminist tradition that says, misogynistically, paradoxically, right, that there's something less than about the sphere of life making, and that what feminism is about like lifting women up out of there, and, you know, insisting that they can be, quote unquote, so much more, like more, you know. This isn't an eco-feminist romanticization. It's recognizing that the communization of care is a qualitative, not just a quantitative, like, redistribution. You know, it's recognizing that, you know, feminism is the weapon that helps us be anti-work, actually. So that's why, I mean, and yeah, I'm stuck here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be feminisming, you know, anti-fascistly, because that's the animal I am. So in a way, I was working something out by, and I hope that it contributes towards an erotics of anti-fascist feminism or feminist anti-fascism, because it sucks actually to be confused about this whole question of like, all these people, are they really feminists? You know, that's a really annoying place to live. And so many of my comrades are actually so bored and not identified with the label feminist. I'm not trying to persuade anyone, by the way. Do you, right? It's just, you know, people are turned off by it because what have we seen in our lifetimes, if depending on your age, like done under the name of feminism, right? Like Islamophobia, whorephobia, you know, humanitarian, carceral sorts of projects of various kinds. Kamala, you know,
Hometown hero.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and so if you Google not a real feminism or not really feminism, you get absolutely hundreds of thousands of results, because it's one of the things we do, right? We kind of like, that's not, if you are doing X, you're not a feminist, right? And that's the sort of, but is anyone really, you know, comforted by this? Is it, do they really believe it? You know, I think the thing we need to learn to think and feel so that we can feel juiced about feminism again is simply, look, feminism is, you know, X and anti-X. It's weird, but it is. It's fascism and anti-fascism. There are just literally enemy feminisms. And that means that you can breathe clear and be like, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a feminist. I might have to punch you in the face if you're on the wrong side of a certain barricade, you know?
Yes. No, I mean, I think, and maybe we should open it up kind of soon.
Yeah.
I don't know what about the time, but just to kind of reiterate, like, how important it is that you hold the complexity together without it like decaying into a kind of multicultural, like everything's the same, right? Because that's the other side of this argument. It's like that, I think that's the dangerous version. And so I love your kind of returning to the necessity of an anti-fascist feminist, you know, historically and our contemporary moment, right? So we don't kind of slide into that other phase. And I'm glad you're, unlike everyone else in San Francisco, you're not going to be evicted from feminism. And so I really appreciate that. Yeah, and maybe we can open it up, get some more.
Hey, thank you so much for this. So I read your article today before coming here on Zionist feminism. And I don't know how much of that appears in the book. But after hearing you talk about Dworkin's work, I'm just wondering if, because I think that the article that I read today didn't say this, but I'm wondering if you think that Zionism and feminism are analogous in some ways in what you're carving out here in terms of an enemy feminism. And I guess I thought about that in what you were talking about, that for Dworkin, like women can't do bad things. And just the creation of a kind of innocent victim, a forever victim status of a minoritized population that's highly weaponized. Like, it seems like you're critiquing, or, I mean, opposing what Dworkin claimed, but do you also see Zionism as analogous to what you've kind of put into words with enemy feminisms here? Hope that's a cool question.
Yeah,
to ask.
thank you for this question.
you.
Well, my understanding of the article I wrote is that I am saying that there is a profound analogy between Dworkin's feminism and Zionism. I mean, she says it. She's saying it. She's telling us, and she's showing exactly why. And I'm hoping that I'm making that clear as well. I think I am saying that. However, very importantly, and this really scares me in this moment. Actually, there are some neo-Dworkinites or Dworkin revivalists, because there's a Dworkin revival of 6 years going on, who said in response to my article of yesterday that we are going to see attempts to link feminism and Zionism as Zionism gets delegitimated in order to delegitimate feminism. Now, I think this is a very dangerous, not just stupid, but dangerous kind of thing to suggest. Feminism is, multiple and anti-fascist, very importantly so, right? I think it is actually true and important to notice that certain kinds of cultural feminists, separatistic, like millenarian feminist or femo-pessimist sort of ideation are swirling and being mobilized as part of the Zionist annihilation of Palestine, and certainly that should be delegitimated as Zionism itself is and should be delegitimated, indeed, gotten rid of. But feminism is also precisely the kind of the force that we need to decolonize the world. Like it's an anti-fascist praxis too, right? So I just being careful there, not to be like, do I think Zionism and feminism are analogous? Well, which feminism? Because Palestinian feminism, it is giving us so much, so many tools, especially over the last 600 days of accelerated Nakba, which itself is 77 years. Of often women-washed genocide. And we were told over the last 600 days that there is essentially a feminist requirement to do genocide, right? But that's what I would say to that. We need to be very careful not to be protective of enemy feminisms. That's what I think could be very disingenuously sort of said right now. In fact, it's the opposite, right? Zionism could be re-legitimated via the attempt to suture it to women's interests. That's classic pinkwashing. That's classic femo-nationalism. Yeah.
Anyone else? No?
Do you have one? No? Sorry, I couldn't see if you had your.
I haven't quite formulated the full question yet, so I'm not really sure what to say.
Well, in that case, yeah. Okay.
I guess, I always have a lot of thoughts. I saw you talk at NYU last year. So I think I asked most of my questions there. But something that I was kind of thinking about, and I'm not entirely sure what question I'm asking with this, but it was just kind of an observation I made while I was listening to you talk about kind of the idea of, oh, I haven't moved, but the left is just kind of like done, you know, like the left has abandoned women. And I was like, that sounds, there's someone that I know, and I was like, it sounds exactly like something that she would say. In fact, I've probably seen her post basically exactly that on her Instagram story. And it was just making me kind of think about, like, how do you, because it's like she's someone who definitely hasn't gone fully off the rails into like J.K. Rowling level of insanity, but she's going in that direction. And it's like, how do you kind of help someone who's going that way? Because I don't want her to go that far. And she seems like a very, like, in other ways, she's a very reasonable person, but it's like it's like watching her fall into this enemy feminism that's like kind of hard. And I was wondering kind of what thoughts you have on, like, can you talk to, like, how do you talk to someone who's kind of like on that edge of really falling into it? Yeah, for sure. Here.
I don't know if I need a mic. Oops, sorry. You want to go under her? Okay. Yeah, no, similarly, just to piggyback on that, like, what would be your advice on handling, like, conversations with an enemy feminist, right? And, like, in terms of, like, the similarity or the overlap with, like, when you're speaking with someone very set in a settler colonizer framework, they can't see themselves. No matter how many comparisons, it's not a facts, it's tied to emotion. And if you just touch even closely to that, it triggers something that it is a violent reaction, at least in my experience. How do you navigate that and get them to see themselves, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm aware we've run out of time, essentially, haven't we? But yeah, it's, maybe Eric has some thoughts too. I'd love you to talk more because you have so much knowledge on this. And atmospheres of violence gives us so many tools about this kind of thing, in fact. But I don't know, there's something about these, you're both asking about conversations, and I think that's, so like I actually chose, and I haven't done that ever before, but I read that section where we have, you know, this is not an enemy situation between Carla J and Marsha P. Johnson, and between Bryn Kelly and Adrienne Rich, right? It's this book doesn't tell you how to differentiate between the difficult, you know, process of, you know, living together even as you piss each other off and disagree and hurt one another, and doing enmity, right? These are extremely different things. It's important to cultivate skills around non-disposability in our movements. The point of naming that there is actually also a thing that is enmity is partly intended and designed to, you know, to take more seriously the importance of everything that comes before that step, where you're not having a conversation anymore. And persuasion is not the operative goal, right? Forget it. I mean, you don't argue or persuade enemies. You fight them. And I don't say that lightly, you know. So, you know, there's something about the approach to people who are going down a certain kind of right radicalization spiral in various modalities. You know, the pleasures of a certain kind of almost like nationalism really is what it is. You know, I think trans exclusionary thought is a genuinely a kind of Brexit. Like, we know this is going to be bad for everyone, but in fact, this was a thing that sociological studies kept finding, that people who voted Brexit said. It was uncanny. Like, people knew that it would be like bad for the economy, bad for society, bad for their daily lives, but they wanted it anyway because they got to have something over the racialized immigrant other. That was more important to them, you know? And that's, I think, what happens around the pleasures of the like, you know, the bathroom as a kind of, the bathroom stall as a little, you know, metonymy of like the nation and the gamete, like, don't bring your gender refugees in my space, and of course everyone suffers. In fact, some of the people who suffer the most, very famously, is you know, butch cis lesbians, right? These are the people who have the worst immediate sort of, anyway, not worst, you know what I mean? Like, in greatest numbers, there's often like, you know, shit consequences. This is known, and yet it doesn't matter because it's still worth it, you know? This is why Richard Seymour is quite useful to read in terms of like, you know, an agile Marxist approach or Marxist feminist approach doesn't imagine that people simply like vote for their interests. No, there are these like affective, mythic draws that supersede sort of economic rationality or class interest or whatever. So I think you're right that there's something like unpersuadable about people who are beginning to be on this tip, you know, whatever tip it is. But I think the thing to do is to maybe wonder about what you can do collectively with people to be more appealing than the alternative. You know, that's why I'm interested again and again in asking people what they think is an erotics of anti-fascist feminism, because there's certainly an erotics of fascist jouissance in the world around us right now. Like, the pleasures of cruelty that are on display are, you know, seducing and recruiting people they're intended to. You know, what is seductive and exciting and irresistible about solidarity and about, you know, anti-fascism? That's what we need to be like figuring out yesterday, because I think that's how you kind of magnetize people away rather than through conversation to some extent.
Anyone else? No? Oh, okay.
Pulling up my memory real quick. Sorry, I will get there. I thought I had it, and I guess I don't. Sorry, my memory's not good. I guess, like, towards the end when you started talking about, you know, Bryn and Adrian Rich, or, you know, all of that, the older parts seem to imply encounter in a very literal sense of, like, Marsha P. Johnson. And I think, at least for me, the only time I'm interacting with anyone from like a group that I know to be aligned with, you know, swerve things, turf things, whatever, is if I let myself argue, which I try not to do, or if I'm like telling people who are upping different things from that org. And I'm wondering what you do think as a like a place we have for, you know, correspondence, not necessarily friendly correspondence, but other than like Twitter, which doesn't seem like it's helping.
Yes. I mean, I think all these questions, like we're all grappling with how to attempt to survive the unsurvivable present that feels like it's closing down. I'm like a very depressing person, just warning y'all. That feels like it's deeply and rapidly closing down upon all of us at every moment. And so attempting to like hold open these spaces, like even enough space to build an erotics of an anti-fascist feminist almost feels like kind of impossible. Like I dream it, I want to dream it into existence, but it just feels like every time you get, you know, it's like, right, and the kind of the ways in which a kind of the discursive regime becomes a trap to lock you into this like cycle of exhaustion because they have all the guns and the money and all we have is like some words, right? And so it's just like, and I think that y'all were touching on this, like the deep, almost like messianic attachment to the belief, right? And that goes back to the Brexit thing where you're like, I think that this book really helps us think about this, like the intensity of the pleasure of annihilating someone else is something that we actually don't have a lot of words for facing. And it's something that we really have to like sit with. And it's terrifying. You know, but then how do we get out of it? And I do think, even though I'm saying all these really depressing things, I do think organizing is always really the only answer, and that can take a lot of different forms, but we need a lot more people doing it, and we need each other to have each other's back so we can act much more boldly and support each other in very material ways all the time. Because I know that, at least for me, that's the only space where I can get a glimmer of like, you know, Benjamin's Angel of History or like some other version of a world that might be survivable is in those moments, and they always feel like they're being foreclosed. So. Wah, wah.
Well, on that note, we're at the top of the hour. And thank you both for gracing our halls. And thank you all for coming.